Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Future Cities podcast. My name is Marissa Matsler, and I will be your host for this month's episode. Today, we're going to be talking about green infrastructure. Now, this is a very popular topic in urban resilience work, and so we've come back to it again and again in talking about the future of cities. On this podcast, you might remember Jason Sauer's episode that explores green gentrification, often, unfortunately, driven by green infrastructure development, or a discussion with myself and Lauren McPhillips that Stephen Elser led regarding different green infrastructure trajectories in US cities. In that podcast, we talked a bit about how different kinds of green infrastructure are built in different cities for a number of regulatory and environmental reasons. But today, we're going to be talking a bit more about the lack of green infrastructure development in general across the US and the world. So to remind everyone here, green infrastructure entails using plants, soils, trees, basically nature and ecosystems to provide benefits and services to humans in cities. For example, we can think about a tree. It can provide shade that's cooling buildings or cooling streets and allowing people to walk during the summer comfortably. The vegetation can be cleaning the air, dealing with air pollution issues, as well as sequestering carbon. Also, the soils at the base of the tree are filtering pollution out of stormwater and wastewater, depending on where they're planted. And so these are a variety of different municipal services that we're used to seeing being provided by something termed gray infrastructure. So gray infrastructure is basically the mechanical pieces and facilities that are used to provide these same services that I just mentioned that the tree could help us provide. Green infrastructure is now held up as a solution to many of the issues that cities are facing due to climate change. So not only can we provide these services in a more sustainable and potentially multifunctional and more aesthetic way, we can also start to address climate change through using green infrastructure. But when we start to examine current development patterns in cities today, we actually don't see much green infrastructure being built on the ground. We see a lot more gray infrastructure being put into place, bigger and better gray infrastructure. So if green infrastructure is so useful, why don't we see more? To better understand this conundrum, I interviewed Dr. David Manuel-Navarrete, a professor of sustainability at Arizona State University. His recent publication examines some of the evolutionary pressures that are working against green infrastructure development in cities today. And some of these same pressures are actually favoring a continued gray infrastructure investment through time. I asked him to tell me a bit more about his findings. And these findings ended up being much more wide-reaching than I originally imagined. We discussed some of the challenges of interdisciplinary work, what it means to be radically transdisciplinary in the academy today, and the importance of subjectivity to sustainability science. What I think David's work really shows us is how important it is to go beyond looking at the technical aspects of green infrastructure. If we want to reap all the many co-benefits that green infrastructure has to offer and truly build facilities that are going to make a dent in climate change, we have to radically rethink the ways we approach science and city building so that they embrace feedback loops and dual causality. And as David shares throughout this podcast, we must dig into our own subjectivities as researchers and confront that embedded nature of social, ecological, and technological systems in city development. So here, we're really going to be talking about green infrastructure in a much wider reaching context than its usual narrow use as a technical stormwater management tool. So let's get to it. Well, hello, David. Welcome to the Future Cities podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So just to get us started here today, can you lay out the problem before us? What is the challenge facing cities in terms of gray and green infrastructure?
So the challenge in a nutshell is that cities are not connected to their local environments and not responsive to also the changes that are happening at the global level in terms of environmental changes. This has happened because we have designed and planned cities from a mechanical perspective, and with an emphasis on gray, hard infrastructure. So in a sense, is that the metaphor of the machine has become so strong in our techno-scientific culture that we are designing cities as if they were machines, but machines are inherently unsustainable. They need a constant external input to run. They are not sensitive to environmental signals and cannot enter in any form of dialogue with it. They cannot adapt to changes in the environment. They are incapable of self-producing or self-regenerating as ecosystems or living systems do. They have not evolved with the environment, and yet our dominant perspective from which we build our cities is this mechanical one. So the first challenge is to start adopting a more organic perspective, to design and make our cities from this new place and see them as self-organizing entities. An organic perspective also entails or would entail radical changes in our local and superlocal governance structures that have been also designed and operate from this more mechanical way of organizing themselves.
So considering the importance of taking this more organic perspective and building more green infrastructure, why do we keep investing in gray infrastructure rather than green? Why don't we see more green infrastructure on the ground today in cities?
Mm-hmm. This is, of course, a key question now. And why do cities continue to favor gray infrastructure and this mechanical perspective, given that we are facing all these global challenges that suggesting that we should do some radical changes, no? And the interesting thing is that, of course, yes, because inertias and path dependencies, we have been doing this for a while, and it's what we know to do best. However, there is an emerging theory, human needs construction theory, which is the one I present in our paper. And this theory proposes that in addition to these inertias and path dependencies, there are evolutionary forces that may be naturally favoring gray infrastructure over green infrastructure. This theory applies the concept of niche from ecology to social ecological and technological systems such as cities. And what it postulates is that the apparent obsession of cities to grow and expand as much as possible through gray infrastructure might be a natural tendency caused by a natural positive feedback loop. So how does this feedback loop work? In a nutshell, cities' environmental engineering capacity to modify their environment for their own benefit, and this includes developing engineering knowledge, training systems that create engineers and other type of experts in gray infrastructure, accounting systems, as well as cultural traits, etc. So all this environmental engineering capacity would give cities access to natural resources from near or increasingly more distant ecosystems. Then part of these resources can be reinvested in developing further this city environmental engineering capacity. That's creating a closed feedback loop. Now, we're not used to think in terms of feedback loops, but because we have been trained to think more linearly, like A causes B and B causes C. But when A causes B and at the same time B causes A, we have a feedback and our brains start to struggle with the idea. No? So this is what is involved here. So when we include the gray infrastructure into this feedback loop, into this equation, what we have is that the investments in environmental engineering capacity allow cities to modify near or distant environments with aqueducts, canals, roads, etc., and to appropriate these resources. And this process is known in this theory as telecoupling. So these resources that are appropriated from distant places are then available to invest in more environmental engineering. Now, because cities compete with each other for scarce resources, there will be evolutionary pressures pushing cities to appropriate as many natural resources from as far away as possible before others do, right? So that's the competitive advantage that the cities would gain. So that there will be therefore a natural selection process between cities, no? That would favor those cities that can create the stronger feedback loops and the stronger telecoupling. Because gray infrastructure such as bridges, roads, dams, or everything made of concrete and hard infrastructure are actually more effective in producing telecoupling than green infrastructure, there will be an evolutionary pressure to continue investing in gray infrastructure, in addition to the inertias and path dependencies that I mentioned before. So as a consequence, it would be extraordinarily difficult to establish an urban development regime dominated by green infrastructure, which leads to a huge paradox, because at the same time, it's extraordinarily dangerous to continue operating under gray infrastructure dominated regimes. So the paradox is that evolutionary forces might be pushing us into our own extinction. Other species like bees, beavers, termites are also environmental engineers and modify their local environment for their own benefit, but not through telecoupling. We humans are much more powerful than these species, and because of this power, we're posing a huge threat to ourselves.
Mm-hmm. I can see that this is very connected potentially with climate change and increasing extreme events in cities. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so interestingly, climate change and extreme events add another feedback loop to this. As I said before, cities have been developing mechanically, constantly appropriating resources from their surroundings through telecoupling. And the outcome of this has been, over time, a global phenomenon of urbanization that this is stabilizing the global climate, the biosphere, and so on. So now we are introducing this new element, which consists of climate destabilization, which causes an increase in the intensity of meteorological extreme events or disasters that cities have in turn to endure. The important point is that this is creating a new feedback loop, as I said, through which the inertias and pressures to invest in gray infrastructure motivate a response to climate change that consists of investing even more in gray infrastructures to protect ourselves from these extreme events. So in other words, the problem here is that the so-called natural disasters are caused in part by our dominant urban model, but we are not making this connection. And then our response to these extreme events is to keep building more infrastructure, more gray infrastructure to protect ourselves, but at the same time strengthen the telecoupling feedback loop that we have discussed before. So instead of undertaking a transformation or transition toward an urban regime dominated by green infrastructure, extreme events are making us or are causing that we do the opposite as we react to them in ways that further contribute to the cause of global climate destabilization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It seems like we're stuck in this path dependency, moving further and further towards these gray solutions. Okay, well, I wanted to also come back to your paper a bit more here, because you describe in depth a case study of some of this human niche construction throughout the history of Mexico City. It's a really robust case study, so I know you have a lot to say on this, but I'm wondering if you can give us just one or two examples of some of the infrastructure transitions you saw in this work coming from Mexico City, and how you saw that transition from gray to green happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mexico City is a very interesting case because the Aztecs developed a model of urban development that was dominated by green infrastructure. Mexico City was surrounded by extremely biologically and ecologically productive shallow lakes before the Spanish arrived and drained them. And the Aztecs used gray infrastructure and that capacity towards enhancing a green infrastructure, specifically green infrastructure that they call chinampas. So the outcome of that was a green infrastructure dominated regime that maximized the ecological functions and productivity of that lake ecosystems in which they inhabited. No? Chinampas were so productive that allowed to create a huge city, probably the largest of its time, without any significant distant telecoupling. No? So then the Spanish arrived and drained the lakes to telecouple the Mexico City Valley to European cities. No, that's the sad part of the story, perhaps. But in the paper, we explore how the city has been trying to develop over after the Spanish arrived. There have been some moments in recent history, in particular, trying to develop a collective intention to switch back into a regime dominated by green infrastructure like the Aztecs did, no? And they are still trying. Which shows how strong the inertias and the evolutionary pressures may be in this case, no?
Yes, yeah, the case is really well developed in the paper. So I encourage folks to check that out. It's a really interesting case to look at these transitions between gray and green and the different forces.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so thank you for that.
Yeah, we hope that through the case of Mexico City, other cities also can learn to develop these collective intentions towards creating green infrastructure dominated regimes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, switching gears just a little bit with this next question. I know when I was reading through this work, I was really fascinated by these ideas. And, you know, my undergraduate degree was in biology. And so a lot of these talking about evolutionary forces and, you know, cultural traits being passed along was quite strong for me. And I really liked those metaphors and thinking about it theoretically that way. But then sort of in the back of my mind, I was hearing the voices of my political science and sociology professors. You know, they're still in there warning me about being careful using a lot of natural science theories to describe human behavior. And so I'm curious if you can talk to us a little bit more about how you respond to some of these worries about a potential for some deterministic assumptions in your work.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you asked this question, because yeah, you're totally right. There could be this reaction as I am mixing things from different disciplines here. My perspective over my career has been radically transdisciplinary, which sometimes can be problematic. But transdisciplinarity is an emerging new, or I see it as an emerging new form of doing science, no? Where we need to accept that knowledge is not just produced by the intellect or just through rational thought. Of course, rational thinking is still important, but it needs to be complemented with emotional intelligence, existential questions, embodiment, and so on. No? So science has traditionally disregarded the subjective dimension of reality, but our current global environmental and sociopolitical challenges require, I think, in my opinion, that science incorporates or at least enters into a more meaningful dialogue with the heart, with consciousness, with the body, with the subjective dimensions of who we are as human beings. Of course, looking at cities from this transdisciplinary perspective is very different to just thinking about cities. A key difference is that social, ecological, and technological dynamics in the cities need to be seen as happening at different levels of organization, and these levels of organization need to be seen as nested or embedded into one another. I think science is starting to think cities from an interdisciplinary perspective, no? Which means focusing on the interrelationships between the social, the ecological, and the technological dimensions. That is trying to understand how the outputs from social dynamics, for instance, become inputs into ecological dynamics and vice versa. And this is an important step. However, from a transdisciplinary perspective, the ecological is seen as embedded in the physical and emerging from it. And the social is seen as embedded or nested in the ecological and emerging from it. At the same time, technologies are seen as ways of manipulating the physical and the ecological from the social. And the important point really is that we cannot make sense of social dynamics without understanding subjective processes. Therefore, we cannot understand cities without considering very seriously the inner lives of its inhabitants, the subjective processes through which people create themselves.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And I really like this perspective on interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. It's a space that I try to work in, and it seems very difficult to work on these embedded and nested systems and to think about emergent properties. I think that's often where interdisciplinary work kind of runs up against a wall.
These emergent properties involve, again, this form of dual or double causality, because there is the emergent level is constraining the lower levels of organization, and at the same time, the lower levels of organization allow the existence of the emergent level. No? So you have one causality going from the emergent level cause the organization of the lower levels, but at the same time, the lower cause the organization or allow, not cause necessarily, but allow make possible and also constrain, of course, the organization of the higher level. So we have two different causalities going in different directions that have different nature. No? It's not the same type of causality going up and down. So yeah, we are, I think, as a species, perhaps starting to understand this property of emergence, which is everywhere. Everywhere works like that, but we have to develop the capacity to process it, to process that the world actually is not a linear causality. It's organized in this emergent way.
Mm-hmm. I'm excited to think more about that because I think that's really the crux of a lot of this interdisciplinary work.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that you actually have a very hopeful message in the end for us, despite all of these evolutionary pressures working against us and this more sustainable or organic model of the city. But you talk in your paper about the power of collective intention and the ways to use this to work against these current evolutionary pressures in cities. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, collective intention will be part of this subjective dynamics, and it emerges when individuals or the inhabitants of a city start creating individual intentions, and then there is also in place a process, a collective process to somehow put all these individual intentions together. And so all this can be seen as a phenomenon that you cannot understand unless you really enter into interact and explore the subjective processes of individuals. So first of all, perhaps we need to understand also the very rigorously and clearly the feedback loops and evolutionary pressures that I have explained before. And then once we create a very solid knowledge of that, we can consciously start creating these collective intentions to break them. No? So understanding feedback loops is tough for us already because we are still schooled, as I said before, into linear thinking. But we need to start by perhaps then changing some educational structures and that allow to create another culture. No? But also need to intentionally change the focus of our research investments. We need kind of a new Apollo project, perhaps, to understand the coupling between this subjectivity and these material dynamics and evolutionary pressures in cities and in other social, ecological, and technological systems. So creating these collective intentions that will be capable of offsetting evolutionary pressures and inertias will require this investment, a strong investment in personal human development and in education and in new research agendas. And for this, we need to change also, start changing, be more open to change our mindsets. And so researchers need to also start exploring their own subjective world. And this is, there is also another dimension to this, which is changing our current management systems. It's more about, it's not just changing the managements, the type of management that we do, but changing the centrality and the power that the managerial paradigm has acquired in our culture. We are operating under an industrial and perhaps a still colonial management paradigm. And this is very useful to manage industries, machines, or even human resources if one wants to reduce humans to that. But another very different issue is to pretend to manage the whole planet. And this is, I think, is one of the scary tendencies that we are seeing. The management paradigm is so strong that one reaction to climate change and to global environmental disruption is to want to manage, to control the whole planet. No? So I believe that we need to realize that the management paradigm is in itself too limited, and it's useful for some things, but not. We shouldn't just approach everything through that paradigm. And we need to start to talk about learning to live in the planet, to inhabit the planet as if we were part of it. We need new practices that promote the cultivation of pro-sustainability subjectivities instead of just pro-material growth or pro-management and control type of subjectivities.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, focusing on subjectivities. And I wanted to ask you a bit more about what you said a little earlier about about researchers understanding their own subjectivity and where they are potentially in the system. Again, this might be one of the barriers that we come up against, interdisciplinary, trying to be transdisciplinary. And I think that this, looking at these subjectivities, can help us cross over. And so I'm curious, what are some of the methods that you begin to use to start to dig into these subjectivities, or is this something that is still emerging for you?
Yeah, it's emerging and it will continue. I mean, it's a process that that's what it makes it exciting, because of course I have been trained in not in that paradigm, but in the more objectivist type of paradigm, and as the majority of us have been. But you find that there are many authors and people increasingly arguing for a change in the way we do science. And it comes from many fields. It comes from mindfulness, a type of mindfulness that is embodied, that incorporates or integrates intellectual processes with existential questions, and not just make us more productive intellectually or more able to operate in the current system. No? One way in which this came very strong to me was by reading Foucault, Michel Foucault. And he has this idea of technologies of the self. And he came to this idea by reading Greek philosophers, because apparently he argues that Greek philosophers their main concern was about technologies of the self, not the technologies of production or technologies of signification that science and the technoscientific culture tends to emphasize more. No? And these are a set of operations that we can perform on ourselves in order to develop or live in a way in which we create a total achievement of life. No, we create a life that we consider happy, worth living. And I have started to apply these technologies of the self to myself, and also I try to incorporate them in education, in ways that students and myself can constantly question the things that we do. Where are they coming from? How did we decide to engage in these practices? Was it a conscious decision, or it was just because everybody was doing those? So this strengthening the self-reflexivity is very important. And science promotes, in principle, that we question everything, and so science is the perfect ground to do this questioning of ourselves. But because of its tradition of not questioning everything outside ourselves, but not questioning ourselves, our own making, I think that's the change. No, we need to keep questioning our perception of the external world, but we also have to add the questioning of the making of ourselves. No? The beliefs, the assumptions that we make about who we are need to be part of the scientific endeavor. So, and the challenge there is that the answer to these questions is going to be different for every subject. No? That's the obstacle for science to do that, because the ideal of science is to obtain replicable knowledge, type of universal knowledge, and you can never and should not try to achieve universal or replicable knowledge about what is to live a happy life, because it's going to look different for everyone, and it's right that it's that way. No? But that doesn't mean that we should not help people to cultivate the practice of questioning themselves about what is to live a happy life for them, right? Mm-hmm. That was a long.
Yes. Yeah, no, that was wonderful. I really like this this reflection on process, because it definitely helps me as a researcher. It's something that I think about a lot, my own place in the research and being more reflexive. And I can see, actually, as you're talking about questioning the internal as well as the external, I can really see that coming out in this paper that you've published here, looking at these evolutionary pressures and forces, and thinking about those cultural traits you know,
Exactly.
that are lining up, and so then they come together to create these path dependencies. So another great thing I think about this work is raising this awareness about this process in general. So through the self-reflexivity, we can start to name these processes, and then in that way, you know, we can start to address them and think, hey, can we change this? Can we think collectively about making changes for the better? And I think that's
Yeah.
one thing that I'm very excited to see from your work.
Yeah, that's a good way of framing it. It's like environmental changes and challenges and global climate change and all these things are pushing us into this new way of engaging with ourselves, in a sense, no? And new way of doing science, of creating knowledge that combines not only what is true outside of us, but what is true for us, no? For each one of us. This idea of combining objective truths with subjective truths, and create meaning through that. No? Create meaning about what the truths that we find outside, like there is climate change happening. I mean, there is an objective truth that concentration of gas is increasing in the atmosphere and everything, but that means something very different to every person, no? To every because every person has created themselves in a different way. We are all different, and but we need to understand how every person can process this big truth that we are changing the planet, putting our own existence under threat. It needs there needs to be this personal digestion in a sense. No, cannot just show that truth and pretend that everyone processes it automatically. No.
Yeah, a very good point. Yeah. Well, before we go, I almost forgot, we have a tradition here on the Future Cities podcast where we ask our guests to summarize their work as a haiku. David, would you like to give it a go?
Sure. Here it goes. Reality flows through our feelings, actions, thoughts. Name your intentions.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that with us. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks again, David, for spending the time to talk with me about your research. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, anytime. It has been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you.
The Future Cities podcast is an outreach effort brought to you by the Urban Resilience to Extremes Sustainability Research Network, or UREX as we usually refer to it. To learn more about UREX, visit www.sustainability.asu.edu/urban resilience. If you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions for future episodes, you can email us at futurecitiespodcast@gmail.com or find us on Twitter at FutureCitiesPod. If you enjoyed the episode, please rate and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.